All right, class, we're going to move into the New Testament Gospels now. We're going to look at what they are, how we should read them, and the different special literary forms we find in the Gospel. Then we'll bring it to some conclusion for the readings in Duval and Hayes. Do you realize, class, that the Gospels comprise just about half of the New Testament? We have the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and this is just about half of what we have in the Gospels. And we're going to see later, as we've already talked about some in class, that the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they are so similar. And then John is literarily so much different than the other three Gospels. So we're going to take a look at that right now. So what are the Gospels? The term gospel actually translates the Greek word euangelion. It means good news. Now this word euangelion could actually be used to refer to good news that's coming from a military victory, or perhaps the good news as it spread about the empire that the birth of a new emperor had happened, or it's used here in the Gospels to refer to the good news of Jesus Christ. So what are the Gospels? The Gospels are foremost and primarily stories. Everybody loves a story. They're interesting. They capture our attention. They enable us to enter the story with the characters that we are reading about. Now, the Gospels have always been viewed as stories, even from the very first time they were used and shared. Some have tried to draw parallels between Gospels and biography. There are some characteristics of biography where we can see this in the Gospels, but the Gospels, unlike modern biography, they don't cover the whole life of Jesus. The events are not arranged chronologically like we would expect in a modern biography. They are related topically. And the different Gospels arrange those topics in different orders at times, based upon the intent of the original author. Now, you'll remember what's the first thing we have to understand about any of the literature in the New Testament. We need to grasp what it is that the original author was trying to get his original hearers to understand. So, there are huge reasons for why each of the different gospel writers choose to topically arrange their material differently. This is very important to grasp. Now, even though Gospels are not like modern biographies, they do have some biographical information in them. And often the ancient biographies followed a certain outline about their characters and were often called lives, L-I-V-E-S, of the life of so-and-so. And these lives had different biographical points that they would try to cover in the biography itself. For example, I often used the simple outline with a large portion devoted to the person's death. Now think about that. That's very similar to our Gospels because the passion narrative, that is the section that deals with Jesus' death, comprises about half of the Gospel of Mark. It's included in Matthew and Luke and John. All four Gospels cover the different elements of Jesus' death, that is his passion. Now also, the Gospels have arranged sayings and stories that communicate the important message about the person. And we'll say more about the sayings of Jesus as we work our way through Duval and Hayes, as well as Fee and Stewart. But there are some characteristics within our Gospels to ancient biography. Now, the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and synoptic is a combination of Greek words. The SYN represents the preposition soon in Greek, and optic means to see. So in other words, to see together. Soon is with or together, to look at together. That's where we get this word synoptic. Now, as we take a look at this graph, class, you can see in your textbook, this is reproduced out of the textbook, some of the events that are reported in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. Now, you'll notice a couple of sections where Matthew covers the centurion of Capernaum, and so does Luke, but Mark does not. Where Matthew agrees with Luke, and it's not included in Mark, these are the sections that modern scholars have called Q, which is from the German word Quelle, Quelle, which means source. So, where did Matthew and Luke get their materials that Mark does not cover? You see, most scholarship today places Mark as the first gospel. Matthew and Luke come along later. They're using Mark's gospel, but they begin to add other items to their gospels that Mark doesn't cover. One of the largest ones that should stand out for you when you read Matthew and Luke, you have these birth narratives. You don't have that in Mark. Mark starts right with John the Baptist. So the question always is, scholars are asking, well, where did they get this material? If Mark is written first and doesn't cover the birth narratives, where did Matthew and Luke get their material? And even their material is different. Matthew covers the interview with Joseph. Luke covers an interview with Mary, and so forth. So these are the questions that are often asked in synoptic studies. So we don't have stories that are collections like someone has walked around with a video camera or a tape recorder. We have the oral stories that are being handed down through various sources, and they're being collected over 2, 3, some say maybe even close to 4 decades of time, maybe even a little longer in John's case. But you get the point. And we see here in this passage, John tells us that Jesus did many, many other things as well. In fact, if you recorded everything down into a book, the world couldn't contain the books. What we can say definitely about the Gospels, they are Christ-centered biography. You'll look there at the bottom of page 273 in Duval and Hayes, and they discuss this a little bit. Christological biography. And this will help you get a handle on what it is that's happening in the Gospels. Now, as we begin to look at these Gospels, we want you to see the two purposes of the Gospel writers. First of all, material has been selected and arranged to tell the story of Jesus. Secondly, through the story of Jesus, each Gospel writer is communicating an important message to the first readers. Hence, class, this is why step 1 is to discover what did the original author intend to say to the original audience. Are you beginning to see how important that fact is? Now look at these two questions, class. The two questions we must ask when we come to the Gospels. What does this small story tell us about Jesus? And secondly, what is the Gospel writer trying to say to his readers by the way that he puts the smaller stories together? For example, question number 2, when you look at Luke 15, we read about a lost coin, a lost sheep, and a lost son. Lost things. He's putting those together, and each one of those stories he has strung together like pearls on a bead to tell us a message. Then what comes in Luke 14, and then what follows in Luke 16. These are critical questions you have to ask when you interpret the Gospels. All right, class, let's consider that first question. How do we read individual stories? Well, one of the most helpful elements and instructions on how to do this is to ask the standard questions. And I promise you, you'll think this is elementary, but if you will do this, you will be amazed at what the scripture will show you. If you just ask who, what, when, where, why, and how. Okay? So now, what I want you to do is read on page 275, read the gospel story here, and then I want you to follow the authors as they answer these questions. Okay? So this is not a bad technique that you could use when you start interpreting your gospel. If you have that as your paper topic, or if you have a sermon or a Bible study that you're going to do the next time, you're going to be in the gospel sometime, so ask these questions. Now, the second thing you need to ask, class, you want to look for interpretive instructions from the author himself. Okay? So often the author will tell you things like narrative pieces and explanational pieces. I'm thinking of when Mark says he'll use a term and then he will say, this being interpreted means, okay, like the word rabbi. This being interpreted means teacher. Little comments like that. Pay attention to those. Remember the illustration of the fish we read about early in the semester. Looking at the details, learning to slow down, take your time, and look for these details. For example, when Luke 14:7 says he noticed how the guests picked places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. Notice the word honor. The guests picked the places of honor at the table. And here's another. Many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Notice especially first, last, last, first. All right, the next thing we look for, class, are taking special note of anything that is repeated. Now, over the next 5 slides, you're going to see this passage in John 15. Notice things that are repeated as you work through this passage. So, what did you pick up from those slides, 4 or 5 slides in John 15? Hopefully, you picked up the word fruit, perhaps branches, abide, command. All of those concepts are repeated and occur throughout that passage. You need to make note of those because they're being repeated. They are special. And also, be alert to when the story shifts to direct discourse. You know what that means? It's like quotation. Somebody's actually saying these things. So watch for those. Be alert. Here is a great example of that. In Mark 4, let's go over to the other side. Verse 38, teacher, don't you care if we drown? Verse 39, quiet, be still. All of these direct discourse elements are there to give interpretation and to show us why Jesus did what he did in this passage. And then, why did the author, in this case Mark, why did Mark include this? Here again, we see the direct discourse as it continues. Now, let's talk about how stories are strung together and how they're connected. In other words, when an author sews, S-E-W-S, sews the stories together, literarily speaking, using a metaphor, what does he use to connect one story to the other? All right? So we want to look for these connections. These connections will often include common themes, patterns, logical connections, transitions, and conjunctions. All right, next we want to look at applying the message of the Gospels. To correctly apply the Gospels, you must keep the larger context in view. Look on page 281, and you can see some examples of this. Okay, and what you're going to need to do, class, is just read through this section, read through it slowly, and follow the author's their pattern of explanation here, and you'll grasp these concepts. One of the most interesting elements of Gospels and literary forms that are used is that of exaggeration. Now, this is no stranger to those of us who preach today. We do like to exaggerate, and we do that for effect. Okay? Well, sometimes when I would tell people how big the fish was I caught, maybe I wanted them to be a little more impressed than they probably should have been. But when this happens in literary form in the Gospels, it really is for effect. So let's look at a couple of these. I think you'll find them interesting. In fact, some of them seem almost ridiculous. Here's an example of exaggeration. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. For it is better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. I remember I heard a sermon one time from an old master preacher of years gone by. He said, why, if we followed that literally, we would be blind and handless in our society. At least in the churches we would be. You see, it's an exaggeration. He's saying, well, what do you think he's saying? He's saying if there's something that you look at or something you do that causes you to sin, then you got to stop doing it. But he uses amputation as an exaggeration on how to stop it. Now, he doesn't mean literally that we gouge our eyes out right? Or that we cut off our hands. So you get the point here. Here's another exaggeration. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. What? We supposed to hate family? That's not what he means. He means that our devotion to him must be so first place and high above everything else that if you compared our love and devotion to him with our love and devotion for family, it could almost be the distance of what we might think of as hatred. Right? All right, chew on that one a little bit. Another literary form is metaphor and simile. Okay? Both of these literary forms make comparisons. Let's look at a couple of them. Here's another one. I am the bread of life. John 6:35. Now, we know that that statement is full of symbolism. It's an I am saying, and that goes all the way back to Moses in the wilderness when he asked God, who shall I say sends me? And God said, I am that I am. And so Jesus is using these I am sayings in John in powerful ways. First of all, that's a deification statement. He uses 7 of these in John. So we have Jesus making the I am statements, and John is arranging them in such a fashion that we see that these are deification statements. I am. He is the great I am from the book of Exodus, right? He's God. Do you catch that? Now, the 7 different I am sayings, here's one, bread of life. It has many connotations. When we take the Lord's Supper, we think about this. In our church, we had Lord's Supper just yesterday, and we took the bread, and it was partaking of his sacrificial giving of his body for us. And it's represented metaphorically in the bread that we take at Lord's Supper. I think you get the point here. But these are great sayings, and these metaphors, exegete them. They're powerful, powerful statements. How about this one? Matthew 23, you are like whitewashed tombs. Oh my goodness. Think about that image. You can beautify the outside of a tomb all you want, but when you open it up, there's nothing but death and stench inside. That was a horrible commentary on these folks when Jesus said this. Oh my goodness, that is a powerful statement. If you think about the implications there, it's metaphor. And if you have simile, it's uses the word like. You are like, you are as. These kinds of statements will show you that they're similes and metaphors. Now we have another special literary form. It's called narrative irony. This literary form uses the principle of contrast. You're contrasting what is expected from what actually happens. All right, here's an example of irony. Jesus tells them a parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. So he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns, build bigger ones, and I will store my surplus there. So I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. And God said to him, "You fool, this night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" See the irony in that? He's making all these plans, but God had different plans. So here's the punchline. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God. In other words, if we don't have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, it doesn't matter how much riches and grain and huge barns and all that we try to store up in this life. It means nothing. Page 285, we see that another literary form in the Gospels are rhetorical questions. A question is asked that makes a point more so than trying to receive an answer. Here's one. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Well, if people love you, and that's the only people you love, well, you've already got that, right? So, you don't get anything extra for loving those who already love you. That's his point. Here's another. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Here's the answer. You are afraid and you still have no faith. Parallelism is interesting. It's a literary form that describes a relationship between two or more lines of text. Let's look at a couple of these. Synonymous parallelism is when the lines say basically the same thing. Look at this next example. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened unto you. All parallel statements. ASK is a great way to remember that. Ask, seek, knock. All three are parallel. We have contrastive parallelism where the second line contrasts with the first. Whoever has will be given more. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken away from them. See the contrast? Developmental parallelism, the second line repeats part of the first line, but then it advances the thought of the first line to a climax. Here's an example. Anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Now, parables, we're going to spend more time at parables next week in Fee and Stewart, but suffice it for this week to say, as an introduction to parables, this is a literary form in where the story has two levels of meaning, where certain details in the story could represent something else. Now, interpreting the parables, look for one main point for each main character or groups of characters. Secondly, the main point must be the ones that Jesus' original audience would have understood. There's that step one again, class. The first step is to determine what the author intended with the original hearers. You starting to get that hermeneutical principle?